welcome to At the Risk of CVE. So just briefly, I do a lot of building, a lot of hacking, I write a little, I advise some, I invest, but this deck has almost nothing to do with me, so I'm not going to talk about myself really at all. I don't work at MITRE, and I have not vetted this with MITRE or the powers that be over at CVE. I did talk to one board member, one of the founding board members at CVE, who said it was interesting. So I hope you find it interesting as well. But anyway, my point of this slide is do your own research. Just because it looks away in my deck doesn't mean it is away. So please make sure that you check and double check my work. So very briefly, what I used for this presentation was this github.com CVE project, CVE list v5. This is the list that comes from official CVE. This is their thing. This comes from the government. I double checked to make sure this wasn't some arbitrary other project. One of the things that to understand about how CVE scores are generated, there is a calculator associated with them. So two people could look at the exact same calculator and come up with different answers. So how they come up with those inputs to decide what thing they're going to put in there, I think is still a bit of dark magic. And it is quite complicated, which I think is basically the reason I think this is worth talking about. So as I did research, I found a lot of stuff hopefully you find interesting as well. So the first issue is the data is just confusing. So in this case, there's an exploit, Internet Explorer, and it's marked as a attack vector of network. So I realize technically that is true. You have to be on the network to be able to attack it, but really that is true of almost every vulnerability, really. I mean, there's some that's you have to be physically in person to do or something or whatever. But really, to me, there really should be a caveat there. It should be a push versus a pull. In the case of Internet Explorer, it's a pull. Like I have to go to a website, pull down the exploit payload, run it, and then a bad thing happens. It's a very different thing than like I'm running bind and you exploit the bind and whatever, and it goes off. So that lacking the granularity of user interaction, at least in V3, is pretty bad. That makes it very confusing if you're trying to figure out whether you should care about this vulnerability or not. So I did a population analysis across all CVEs in the let's see, it's a couple days, a handful of days ago. So it's 2025-02, February 14th. But this doesn't change that much day to day. I ran it a couple months or a couple weeks earlier, and it only slightly changed. It's like a 0.5% different here and there. But there's well over 200,000, 280,000 vulns or so in the CVE population as of that date. And of those, the vast majority, almost 70% of them, are currently unscored. And worse yet, there's a whole bunch of things that aren't CVEs at all. So like I came up with an exploit in Python called Python NaN injection that didn't get a CVE. Basically every SQL injection you've ever found is not going to get a CVE. There was one example where there was a library that was in 40,000 different applications. They didn't get 40,000 CVEs. I'm not even sure they got one. So if you think that application is safe, it is not safe. And there's a whole bunch of stuff they just haven't gotten around to. So this is the kind of the current suite of things we're looking at. The other thing is I'm going to talk about this quite a bit later, but there's a difference between a CNA, which is the CVE numbering authority that's been delegated to put a score on something, versus the NVD, which has a score of itself. So you'd think, I was going to do an analysis of like what the difference is, because there is a difference. Like, are all the CNAs high? Are they low? Or what are they trending? Is what the analysis I'd like to do. But the CVE project does not contain the original NVD score. So the guidance is just use the CNAs because they have better context. But they may not have better context. They may be wrong or misleading or something. So unfortunately, I just don't have access to that data in the JSON. It's just not something they provide. That might change over time, so this may not be true long-term, but it's hard to do this analysis against NVD. So this is a flag within the CVE JSON that basically says the exploitation is active. And if you notice, you're going to see quite a bit more happening basically after 2008, and nothing really at all happening in 1999 to 2001. So that makes sense. There is some recency bias here happening basically around 2021. You'll notice 2021, a lot of things change. But I think maybe that's just because the vulnerabilities are quote unquote new, even though they aren't that new. And maybe we'll see an uptick in the exploitation over time as basically time passes and bad guys shift to more modern exploits as they need to. Of the vulnerabilities, only about 6.6% of the vulnerabilities have references to publicly exploitable code. So they actually have a link somewhere to go download this. If you notice, there's a massive spike right around 2008, which I thought was interesting. But I think that was just a very popular time for people to be launching exploits and showing off that the exploits did work. Maybe that's what was going on with a big dive after that. But it seems to be getting a little tiny bit of a resurgence just in the last couple of years. Again, something weird happened in 2021. I'm just not sure what that was. So KEV is supposed to be an answer to some of these problems. It's known as the known exploitable vulnerabilities. But what about the other exploited vulnerabilities that we know about? And so I really think that to properly understand KEV, you kind of have to think about it as the other known exploited vulnerabilities that are missing from KEV, and really kind of think about it more as it's a slice of known vulnerabilities, and it might be out of date. We'll get to that in a minute. So KEV is currently 0.45%, and again, these numbers change a little bit over time. So again, do your math, but so about 99.55% approximately of vulnerabilities are not in KEV, which means to me approximately 99.55% of vulns, according to KEV being the exploited vulnerabilities, simply do not matter. Now, I have reasons to believe that's not true, but that's sort of what this math kind of tells you. If you look at the KEV base scores over time, you'll notice all of them are pretty high. It's hovering around 8.37 out of 10. And that kind of makes sense to me. I mean, you should see them a little bit high because these are presumably vulnerabilities that matter a lot. They're critical vulnerabilities because they're actively being exploited, or theoretically anyway. But then I started plotting it against this population of vulnerabilities. So on the left, you see the KEV score distribution. Every KEV that's ever been included in the database of the 1,200 or so, against you'll notice it's a different y-axis. The CVE scores across the entire population of all CVEs. So there's two things of note. One is the CVSS scores are pushed over a little bit. They're not exactly like a bell curve hovering where 5 is the middle number. It's sort of shoved over. It's like closer to 6 or 7 or something. And then also the other thing to note is it's really weirdly spiky. Instead of it being a nice kind of flat bell curve, which you'd expect in a large enough population of vulnerabilities, it's like up and down, and sometimes it's not there at all. It's just very strange. And so that caused me to do a bunch of research, which I was not expecting to do. So if you take the top 10 most common CVSS scores, it equals about 50% of all vulnerabilities. So 50% of all vulnerabilities are this left column. And then if you include the least common CVSS scores that have any value at all, that doesn't even equal 0.5% of all vulnerabilities. So you are 6,361 times more likely to have a CVSS 7.8 than a 1.3. But even weirder, on the far right corner column there, the CVSS scores that never occurred, there's a whole bunch that have never ever been used in the history of all 280,000 vulnerabilities. And so my mind was just like, what is going on? I mean, it would make sense maybe if 10 were never used and 0.1 were never used, maybe there would be, maybe that's part of the bell curve, but that's not what this is saying. And so that caused me to dig in further. And so I was pretty naive going into this originally. I'm like, okay, well, how you calculate score is impact score plus exploitability score. But my Cro-Magnon brain is sitting there going, wait a minute, that does not equal 9.8 and it doesn't equal 10. Like, I don't understand. It's 9.9. So what is going on? Well, what's going on is there is a thing called CVSS math, which you have to kind of familiarize yourself with. So firstly, if the impact score is less than or equal to 0, then it's 0, which is weird because you'd think it would just be 0, but whatever. Like, how can you get an impact score of a negative number? But apparently that's possible. And then you take the base score, you round up, which is already causing issues. Then you take the minimum, which basically is looking for within the first 0.0 or 0.1 or 0.2 characters or whatever of the score. So they don't want 0.05312 or whatever. They want some smaller, easier to deal with number. And then you multiply it times 1.08. And this is the part that got me. I'm like, wait a minute, why? Like, everything up to there kind of makes sense. Like, you want it to be kind of round numbers. But that one was like, where did you get 1.08? And I looked through the specification. There's no explanation, and I haven't heard or seen any explanation. I'm sure there is one out there, but if someone finds it, I'd love to know why. And so I noticed that 9.5 never appeared in CVSS 3 scores. And I'm like, well, that's odd. I mean, I did see it in the population of other versions, not 3.1 or 3.0, but in 3.x or whatever, there was never a score of 9.5. I'm like, what is going on? Well, if you try to solve for 9.5, where C is the value that you need to solve for, and you have to multiply that number by 1.08, so it has to be greater than 9.4 and less than 9.5, it turns out that that's just not possible. That combination of numbers just can never exist. And so that caused me to do a bunch of other analysis. So this is the CVSS scores, the entire population of CVSS scores across the entire population. And if you notice, there's a 17% shift up from 5. So this kind of shows what I was showing on that other slide. Everything was sort of shifted over a little bit. Well, that 1.08 multiplier and the round up does account for some of this, but not all of it, but some of it. So then I wrote a calculator that basically brute forces all possible combinations of CVSS version 3 to see what possible combinations you'd get if you multiplied every single value and tried every single thing. This is what the population looks like. So if you notice, it is shifted over. It's the average score is 5.6, but if you look kind of like center mass, it's more like 6 or something. So that's already 10 points higher than a 5.0. And then, or 1 point higher if you're just doing integers. But then also there's this big spike over at 0.0. And then there's nothing between 0.01 to 1.5. And so that seems weird. And also you see that dip at 9.5. There is one at 9.7 despite what it looks like, but I think it's literally just one. And if you plot it against all of the vulnerabilities over time, that does make sense. We're seeing what I am seeing. There are some values at 0.0. There's none at 1.1 over to 1.5. And then there's kind of a weird mix of stuff all over the place. There's a weird spike at 7.8, but I think what's happening there is there's some values that are just much more likely for someone to click on, which is why you're seeing such a big spike there. So then I went back and I'm like, okay, well, 3.0 is probably an improvement over 2.0. So let's take a look at 2.0 to see what it looked like. And sure enough, it is better. Average score is 5.2, which is a little closer to being center, so that's good. But it's got way more spikiness and way more holes in the middle of it, which is not great. Fewer combinations of possibilities. So what about 4.0, which is the most recent one? So I took a look at the population of all the different versions to see how common each one of them were. If you notice, CVSS version 4 is actually growing over time, except for the weird part is we're still using V3, 3.1 and 3.0, which is odd. And I think what's happening there is there's probably some legacy calculators out there that people are still using. But anyway, so 4.0 is coming on. And here's what 4.0 looks like. So if you notice, it's not a bell curve at all anymore. It's this weird, strange kind of spiky mass all over the place. It turns out that 10.0 is not even possible, which is interesting. And there's big kind of holes right after 9.5. But at least I would think one of two things would be possible. Either it'd be a nice dome looking thing, or it'd be completely flat, because every possible combination is equally likely to be able to be reached. But it turns out it is neither. The other weird thing about this one is the average score, the likelihood of you landing on any score goes down to 4.9. So it's actually lower. It's the lowest of the 3 or 4 that I looked at. This is the probability of you getting any score at all. So the reason why the numbers is 1% less is because it's not exactly 100 values, because it's 0 to 10. So it's actually 101, but I don't know why it's that. But anyway, 75% likely of landing on any score for CVSS2, 84 or 83 for CVS3. But CVSS4 is actually less. It's less likely that you'll get any score that you're expecting to get out of that 63. And this is the calculation of all possible, all brute force combinations, all calculations that you have to go through to get to any one of these scores. So CVSS2 was the easiest. There's only a handful of variables that go into it. CVSS3 is sort of middle of the road, but CVSS4 requires quite a bit more work. There's quite a few more variables, a lot more things to think about, which is another reason why we might not see as many people using CVSS4. We're also seeing a great middling of the data, which is actually backed up by this graph. If you notice, the trend line is up for medium and down for basically everything else, maybe slightly higher for low. But the great middling is probably because it just turns out people are more likely to hit certain numbers than other numbers. So there were 19 CVSS values of 0.0. And so I wanted to take a look at one. This is an XRDP vulnerability, which is similar to RDP, just a different version of it. There were no known workarounds for this issue. And I was not able to find any reason why this would be eventually marked as a 0.0. None. There was nothing at all to make me believe that that would be the case. In fact, if you look at the vectors, they're identical. So I think what happened is they just typoed this. This probably should be like a 9.0 or a 10.0 or something. I don't know what happened here, but I think sometimes people just make mistakes, and that's how this ends up in this system. If you look at KEV versus CVSS version, any versions where the CVSS score is 9.0 or greater, which I would believe is a critical level vulnerability, the overlap in that population is only about 5%. So again, are you saying that there is wildly less than flip of a coin likelihood that a CVSS 9 will ever be exploited by an adversary? Because that's sort of what this data is saying. So this is the KEV breakdown per year. If you notice, there's nothing before 2002, and you're seeing that pretty big drop off after 2001. Again, I think there's a recency bias. These are the KEVs population by criticality. So if you notice, the biggest one is high. Critical is sort of medium or whatever, middle of the road. But there's also some lows in there, which kind of threw me. And then there's also 54 that have no score at all. So you can't rely on the score at all to tell you whether something is going to be currently exploited or not. And so I plotted this on a pie chart. And when I was looking at it, the more I looked at it, that low was just standing out like a sore thumb. I'm like, what is going on with that low? So I found one. This is a Samsung vulnerability that is currently being exploited. If you notice, the NVD ranked it as a medium, and Samsung changed the availability score, meaning the availability of the device goes from a highly available issue from a high to a low. And so that changed their base score, presumably to a 3.3 low, despite the fact that it is currently being exploited. So even more reason to not believe the CVE, CVSS scores have really anything to do with whether something's being actively exploited in the wild or not. So who are you going to trust? The NVD, who historically overestimates the vulns, or the CNAs, who are incentivized to reduce the score? So There is good reasons to believe and work with the CNAs. And so this is a comparison of the unscored CVEs and CVEs over time. If you notice, there is kind of a big drop-off happening right around 2000, 2001, which is great. That's actually kind of what you'd want to see. And it's shown better on this graph, where you're seeing a big drop-off in the percentage of unscored CVEs and CVE over time, which is wonderful. That means it looks like the CNAs are actually doing their job and maybe not working through the backlog. Like anything before 2015, you're probably out of luck. But any of the newer vulns, it looks like that they actually are getting to, which is great. So then I looked for the distribution of how long it takes between the time that they are asking for a CVE number and the time it takes for them to launch that to the world, to actually give this information out. So as you'd expect, there's a nice sort of like logarithmic fall off there. But the thing that really threw me was this: why is this graph going off to 4,000? Like there's something weird about this data. So I threw it on a log scale, and sure enough, yeah, there's a whole bunch of vulns like well out there. And then there's also a whole bunch like around 1,500, 2,000, 25. So this is like multiple years of delays before these vulnerabilities get out in the wild, which is pretty interesting. But the one that I really wanted to focus on was that one of these really old ones. So here's a vulnerability that came out in 2011. And then in 2012, they asked for a CVE for it. And then finally, 11 years later, they finally got around to publishing it to the wild. I don't know why they did that. Why bother? Just some ancient old vulnerability. But, there you have it. So this is just showing the cumulative growth over time. I think this is part of the reason why the NVD kind of declared bankruptcy and is now requiring the CNAs to take over, because it might have been possible to do like hundreds of vulnerabilities a year, but now we're going to probably reach well over 40,000, maybe 44, 46,000, somewhere in that range of vulnerabilities in 2025 at this rate. There's just no way that a very small staff inside CISA or whatever, or NIST, are going to be able to handle that. There's just no way. So they've got to delegate it. So that kind of makes sense about what's going on there. So CVE is also seems to be quite out of date for a variety of reasons. It seems that like it's a lagging indicator. It seems like they've got to get some consensus before they move on to say, yeah, this thing probably should be in CVE. So you probably need to augment that. And from what I've been told from people who are kind of insiders, in many cases, it's delayed 18 months or so. So I wouldn't use CVE as the only barometer, although it's a good one. I just wouldn't use it as the only thing I use to decide whether I'm going to get compromised or not. The other problem is CVEs are math. You should say that a CVES score of 1 is 10 times less bad than a CVSS score of 10. That's just what the data says. But it doesn't work out that way, because if you had a full replacement cost of a laptop that's $1,000 and a CVSS score of 1 on it, are you telling me that the maximum worst possible thing in a world-ending vulnerability could only be $10,000, which is 10 times $1,000? Like, that just doesn't make sense. And so from a CFO or CPA perspective, like none of this math seems to make sense to me. So the other thing is I found this really interesting paper from Watchtower, really fascinating. I'm not going to go into it, but long story short, they found a open S3 bucket that CISA was linking to in one of their advisories. So I went there thinking, okay, this will be great for screenshot for other issues going on here. And I looked at it, and sure enough, while the paper that I was referencing came from February 4th of 2025, the last time they revised this page was 2013. I'm like, well, that's great. That means that issue is still going to be there. But it's not. It's missing. And so I don't think you can trust the CISA website to be accurate with regards to the last visited date or things they might have changed on the web page, which is even more reason from my perspective that you really need to download this data and analyze it yourself and not rely on their website or them to do whatever they should be doing. Got to double check their work. So there's a couple of ways that things can be that you should probably stop looking at them. One of them is a CVSS 0, I would assume, despite the fact that we saw one example where maybe you really shouldn't. Another one is this disputed flag. So unless you really know what you're doing and you really dug in, this disputed flag is really kind of hard to find. This particular vulnerability is in a Ubiquity UDM Pro where it has a default password. Well, it turns out I totally agree with this being disputed because it turns out you need to be physically next to the device while it's being installed. And as it's being installed, it asks you to change the password. So yes, every router on Earth has this problem because every router on Earth asks you, gives you the password up front or shows you like you need to change the password immediately. So yeah, it's disputed because it's not a vulnerability. And the disputed percentage over years seems like it spiked and then went down. From the back channeling I've got about this, it seems like this was a thing that they wanted to focus on, and then they decided there's better ways to do it. So I was looking for other ways to do it. This is the population over time. But there's also a rejected flag as well. And I think rejected is probably going to take over disputed. And disputed is kind of the middle ground between not rejected and rejected, I guess. I'm not sure because it's not really well documented, or at least not where I've found. But we are seeing that there's a pretty big drop off in rejected over time. So maybe the quality is getting better. I really don't know. I don't know what happened in 2017 where a huge percentage of vulnerabilities were rejected, but apparently there's quite a few more that are also getting rejected. And then you have APPSEC. So APPSEC is supposed to fix this issue. So that same Ubiquity vulnerability we were just talking about where the default admin password, they apparently ignore the fact that this is disputed vulnerability and are still saying that there's a chance of exploitation of 0.04%. So, some number out of 1,000 UDM pros are going to get compromised by this vulnerability. Like that is not true. That's just not going to happen. So APPSEC apparently does not take this into account yet. I hope at some point they do, but currently they don't. And so here's the so what. I mean, I think basically every vendor, Qualys included, has to somehow make sense of this, and it's overly complicated. And so if you're not using something to take some context about this vulnerability and apply it to your environment and sort of kind of blur your eyes and maybe even forget what the CVSS score is and apply your own criticality score to it, or apply some more granular knowledge of it, you're probably going to be doing things you shouldn't be doing, working on things you shouldn't be working on, etc. So I talked with the Qualys guys about it, and they really are bullish on it as being sort of a cornerstone of helping people be more proactive about fixing things that are currently being exploited. And I actually agree with that. I think you really should focus on things that are actively being exploited. There's just a much bigger population than Kev that is being exploited. So basically, if you're using AppSec, if you're in AppSec rather, CVEs, you're just never going to have them anyway, or very rarely going to have them. So you're already doomed there. But also in NetSec, if you're just blindly using CVEs, I think you're going to run into a lot of problems. And that basically means you're just working on a lot of stuff that just ultimately doesn't matter, or isn't going to get exploited, or couldn't be exploited in some of these cases. So yeah. And so there's my contact information. Let me know if you got anything for me, and back to you, Mike.